My name is Greg Remke. This is part 2 of a presentation for the NCFCA LD topic, Lincoln Douglas value topic, that is, in the context of innovation, the proactionary principle ought to be valued above the precautionary principle. And in part 1, I discussed where the term proactionary came from and the phrase proactionary principle. And I'll talk some in this session about the precautionary principle and how it came to be used in the environmental movement, and proactionary is, in a sense, a response to that. So in part 2, we will discuss, and my video of the first one is on YouTube. I should have a link to it. So innovation values, benefits, risks. So the values are the benefits, prosperity, wealth, saving lives, extending lives, improving lives, but there are risks too. Innovation offers new and better goods and services. If we put too many limits, too many precautions on that, if we have to prove that nobody gets hurt or can get hurt or nothing can go wrong, then we forego many benefits from innovation that would serve a great number of people. And you could look at that on utilitarian grounds or natural rights grounds. So benefits: life, health, security, safety, prosperity, wider choices, work choices, leisure choices, environmental benefits. We have the technology to clean the environment, to burn fossil fuels with much less pollution than we did before, for example. But then there's risks and harms from new innovation. New chemicals, 200 new chemicals introduced every year, to everything from food preservatives and emulsifiers to new coatings on our clothing to make them feel better or maybe not wrinkle. But those chemicals often aren't tested with wide numbers of people or in circumstances. And so without that kind of testing, how do we know that we aren't introducing more risks into the system? Similarly, with automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, we're introducing a job insecurity. The claim is that more people will lose their jobs, be replaced by robots or AI, as well as, the fear of killer robots and swarm drones and other dangerous things that could be used by angry people or terrorists. So we have the general sense as we regard risks, is how do we deal with risks? How do we evaluate them? And certification is, along with insurance, is a way to deal with risk. And I talked in the last session some about underwriters' laboratories. I'll talk more here about that. The thing is that risk is often a little tricky to consider. For example, when an airplane crashes, it's all over the news. There's a huge impact because all those people, die at once. But yet every day, far more people die in car accidents, one by one. So the asymmetry of disasters makes us possibly fear flying more than driving, even though driving is far more dangerous than flying. And so there's examples like that. Climbing ladders is more dangerous than a lot of things we do. Okay. So this is an article on this that mentions this discussion of the precautionary principle and so it's talking about, and this is a continuation, I think, article I started before, and I offer this because it just had this discussion in it that, there's new dangerous technologies, but we don't want to ban them. So scooters aren't the only scary thing that turns up. There's ride-sharing services, autonomous cars, AI systems, cashless stores. All these sort of offer concern and fear to people, and they get banned in different municipalities. But we don't know how safe they are until we try them. So he says, experiment with them carefully. So what these efforts have in common, he says, is that philosophers like him called the precautionary principle, the idea that new technology behaviors, policies should be banned until their supporters can demonstrate they will not result in significant harm. The Hippocrates idea in ancient Greece: first, make sure you do no harm. So he gives some history. This precautionary principle sort of enters the political conversation in the 1980s in context to environmental regulations. Damage to the environment's hard to undo once you do it. So the concern is these chemicals, should have been tested first before they did the harm. So maybe we should. So that was the European Union, for example, has banned genetically modified organisms with the idea that, gosh, we don't know what sort of harm it's going to cause. Now, billions of people have consumed genetically modified food. They've been on the market for decades, but still there's fear that something new is going to happen. So this author is saying the right way to look at most new technologies is they're not creating irreversible harms, although some do generate harms. And then he discusses sort of how to separate between things like, fission power and nuclear bombs and other technologies. So in terms of the concern about new technologies costing jobs, taking jobs, this has a long history. This comes up with robotics, new robotics technologies, automation, with artificial intelligence in the service industry. And a classic book on this from the Foundation for Economic Education by Henry Hazlitt, who is a great economist and journalist, popular writer. One of the chapters, chapter 7, is called The Curse of Machinery, and he shows that this fear that new machinery, new technology, destroying jobs, disrupting households, it's been around for a long time. And so, economic fallacy, destroyed 1,000 times, it keeps reemerging from the ashes. Each new technology looks a little bit different than the one before. So the belief that machines cause unemployment would lead us, to ban all technology to create endless jobs. So it turns out that, yes, people are pushed out of jobs when new technology can replace them, when automation, robotics. But to the extent that it lowers prices, increases productivity, that creates new jobs at the same time. So we have many examples from the past of technologies that were feared, that people, that legislators, that unions tried to ban, and yet looking back 5 or 10 years later, huge increase in jobs. And actually, Hazlitt discusses this in English history with the textile industry, textile mills replacing home looms, and how vast industries and jobs were created, and everyday people could afford clothes, which they couldn't do when clothes were woven by hand at home, person by person. So political scientist Anthony Gill at the University of Washington has an article on this, on is it time to rethink Labor Day? And this is relevant to the Precautionary debate. He writes, in 1910, workers in these various industries, 46% of the non-farm workforce. By 2015, that dropped to 14%. The service sector went from 38% to 77%. So these millions of jobs were destroyed by automation, but new jobs, higher paying jobs, less hurtful jobs in terms of stress on our body and our spirit were created. So labor historians may attribute, he says, prosperity to forces promoting labor rights and unions. That was not so much it. The bulk of improved living standards came from technology advances, from machinery that could take the place of, riveting for a car, or mining deep under the ground and people dying and breathing in toxic fumes in a coal mine, replaced by giant machinery that was safer for people, more highly productive, created more prosperity. Now, it's true, we never got those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of coal mining jobs back, but that's okay. We have less country western songs like Coal Miner's Daughter than we used to, but people don't die and suffer the way they used to. So let's try and find, you have to debate the negative on this. So how do we find ground for the precautionary principle? Well, here's an article on sort of an unintended consequence of this cool technology that we're experiencing in the last decade, that in this article called Eliminating the Human. It's an interesting article in MIT Technology Review, and I encourage people to read it and think about it. But he argues that new technologies, gadgets, they offer value, benefit, But what if it's an unintended harm? He argues they're eliminating the human interaction. So we're beset by immersed in apps that do things for us that replace us actually going out and seeing people, talking to people. We go into the store, we may see someone, we talk to the cashier, we have an interaction with people. If we do all this ordering online, somebody shows up with a car and we say hello and they drop it at our door, but it's not a relationship like you do going to a store. And he's arguing that these things designed by engineers are often embodies sort of the fear of interacting. When you meet somebody new that you don't know, or go to your first debate tournament or debate class, that's not a happy. That's not for most people. That's a little scary. A new skill you don't know, a bunch of new people you don't know. A lot of things can go wrong. You make a fool of yourself at your first debate. People laugh at you, or surprised, or you get stuck. You can't remember what you're going to say. It's like football, where they used to say about passing the football, 3 things can happen and 2 of them are bad, the incomplete or the interception. Similarly, going out and meeting people is fraught with peril, but it's important for us to develop our social skills, and he makes the case that this new technology may have an unintended consequence of taking away some of that human interaction. This could be the case with the debate tournament that's virtual. It's far more efficient. Nobody's got to leave home. It's safer. No chance of a traffic accident. But of course, as anybody who's been in it, you miss a lot of the benefits of actually being a swirl of people at the tournament. And things can go wrong both at the tournament and trying to do a virtual online tournament. So the benefits of human interaction are sort of spread out and hard to measure. And here's a separate concern on this. The idea that a lot of what goes on with new technologies, with advertisements online, with Facebook or YouTube or Google, there are people giving us information about products we didn't know about. This is advertising. People sort of get a sense of what we want from our internet searches, and they advertise stuff that we might want, and we say, wow, that's just what I was looking for. So is that just informing us so we can find things that we want, that we'd like to have? Or can this be more like manipulation? Like Facebook only shows you certain sorts of things to try and shift your view in one way, or is it just trying to show things you like? So then maybe you only hear stuff from people that already agree with you. You're less likely to get upset, but on the other hand, you're less likely to be exposed by ideas you disagree with. So to what extent can persuasion or giving people what they want be more like manipulation, sort of putting them in a bubble where they only hear things they agree with? So, lots of opportunities with what an app can do. Find out what you like and give you more of it, but trade-offs on that. You don't get to see things that maybe you disagree with at first, but later might think are valuable. So back to the new ideas of technology, regulate or certify new innovative tech. And again, I think I spoke about this some in the last session. This is from a post on economic thinking that is more on the artificial intelligence reform policy topic, but it's relevant for our precautionary LD topic. So there's private sector, for-profit companies making these products, but there's also non-government organizations, NGOs, and these involve clubs, charities, churches, universities, foundations, other nonprofits, plus a whole range of technology certification and standards groups. And these have a lot of role to play in setting the safety standards for new technologies. And this article in my post, Regulate or Certify Emerging AI Technologies, the author talks about electricity, a new technology in the 19th century that frightened a lot of people. It was dangerous. You could shock yourself or kill yourself with electricity. Imagine you're introducing, trying to get people to buy electricity to power their lights in their house, and they're thinking, wait a minute, the same stuff that powers lightning, isn't that going to hurt? Well, so what we got, instead of government regulation for precautionary principle, we got certification process. And this was Underwriters Laboratories that developed to test all electrical appliances, and they still do, to make sure they're safe. So there's all sorts of innovation, new ideas, battery-powered things. I have a little battery-powered chainsaw. I mean, handheld, that's got to be pretty dangerous, but it goes to Underwriters Laboratories to see that the design and safety features make it safe so I'm less likely to hurt myself or someone else with it. And that's with the whole range of these innovative electrical and other power tools that somebody's tested them. And that's not the company itself, they just want to sell the product. But somebody's got to insure it, and they want to make sure it's safe. Somebody's got to have expertise in design and ergonomics for safety, and that's what UL does. The author in the article I quote in this says, to their credit, UL has progressively expanded the range of consumer product safety issues it addresses beyond electrical and fire hazards. It now tests water and food safety, environmental sustainability, hazardous substance, and a wide range of products, and now it's moving into the AI field as well to certify new AI technologies to see that they're safe, to see that they work as expected. Now let's shift to proactionary precautionary in a very relevant current affairs issues, which is, the pandemic and the lockdown and drugs and pharmaceuticals and medical testing. How safe is safe enough? We have a system in the U.S. that, unlike Underwriters Laboratories, which is a non-government organization to certify for safety, we have government regulation with the Food and Drug Administration, and they have an onerous system to try and make sure drugs and medical devices are safe. But the flip side of that is it's raised the cost of getting these devices tested and approved dramatically. Millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars for some technologies that maybe could be approved far less expensively. And yet these things that are approved are still unsafe. So it's a risk of action versus inaction with biomedical technology, but also it fits with this precautionary principle. So, for example, proactionary, you might say, well, gosh, when the pandemic hit, let's get all the tests and treatments out there. Let's make sure they're safe, but let's try stuff and see, and deploy it quickly. Make new masks, make new ventilation systems to reduce COVID in the air. Let's have COVID tests so people can find out before they go out each day whether they're infectious. So, Rutgers University developed a spit test. You spit on this substance, and it can tell you in 10 minutes if you have COVID and are infectious. And, great. So then that should have solved everything in, April of 2020. The test should have been deployed and, a couple dollars per test. But the FDA wouldn't approve it. It was limited. They allowed Rutgers to use it, but only at Rutgers. You had to be there in person. That didn't work. Mouthwashes apparently had some effect on COVID, but that couldn't get approved. In Denmark, they have dogs at the airport, and they can smell who's got COVID. So instead of this onerous testing and other stuff, you just have dogs. I think they have one at airport in Florida. Voices, your phone can tell by your voice if something's wrong and give an indication of COVID. And then you've got a vast number of treatments, antibody infusions and others that could reduce COVID or cure it. And these are not the controversial, the ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine and things like that. Those are contentious, but those were safe. They've been tried by millions, billions of people. So why should there be any concern that these be tried and tested with COVID? Because people weren't at risk. In other words, they weren't at risk from the treatment. But instead, these were blocked because though they were certified as safe, they weren't certified for use with COVID. And the FDA wouldn't approve them. And so decades go by. Months go by, I meant to say. I'm getting excited there. Months go by, and only a year later do we have the vaccines, and we still don't have the treatments that we could have had. We still don't have spit tests because of the FDA with its precautionary principle, as opposed to what would have been better, I would argue, a proactionary principle. So, and there's another, away from the controversy of COVID testing, are simply biomedical devices to test our health. Our smartphone and Fitbit, I have a Fitbit on this wrist that can measure my sleep and number of steps and some health measures. And in fact, this had the ability to measure my blood oxygen level. This was technology that was put in it years ago, but it was unapproved by the FDA because that would make it a medical device. And this is a sports fitness device. So they would have to certify it through FDA. Interestingly, and back to COVID, people who got COVID and recovered from COVID were in real danger of what I think they call it happy pneumonia. Pneumonia hits and you don't feel it for some reason, but you're getting infected. Your blood oxygen, the oxygen level in your blood goes down dramatically. It's really dangerous, but you don't notice it. But a blood oxygen sensor would. So you should have a $20 blood oxygen sensor. Whenever you feel weak, you test it. You find your blood oxygen should be 100%. Anything below, 95, 94 is a concern. And people with pneumonia, they felt good, but if their blood oxygen went to the 80s, they should go directly to the emergency room. And the Fitbit could have told that. Alarms could have gone off. So we didn't have that because the FDA wouldn't approve it. Now, Apple later spent millions of dollars to get their Apple Watch certified to have that, and other devices from China have that as well. And I think the FDA, the new ones are certified. And there's other things that these devices can measure. And I have more about that in a separate talk on biomedical technology. So precautionary or I've got preactionary, it should be proactionary or precautionary vaccines. Vaccines were available early in 2020. FDA didn't approve them until they went through a certain set of tests, but they could have had a challenge test with hundreds or thousands of volunteers, healthy young people saying, okay, I'll take the vaccine and then I'll purposely expose myself to the coronavirus and see how the vaccine works. Then we would have a lot of early data on which were safe and how effective they were. Instead, we have to wait until November, December to even begin rolling out those vaccines. And in the process, hundreds of thousands of people died who might not have. And we would have had a lot more time with safety testing than we did under the status quo. So you can find benefit in that if you're pro or anti COVID vaccines. So FDA is sort of the worst case precautionary principle of delaying. And again, and what economists often say, type 1 versus type 2 errors, FDA really wants to make sure that no device or drug is approved that has bad effects, kills people, hurts people. And in a sense, that's great. But that also leads to type 2 errors, which is devices that would help people, save their lives perhaps, they don't get approved because, and it's invisible, it's less visible. So rich people fly to Mexico, fly to Europe or Japan to get medical procedures and devices that aren't legal here. And rich people can do that, but thousands, tens of thousands of others die here waiting for FDA approval. So it's not a balance. And a different way to do that would be certification, groups like Underwriters Laboratories and insurance companies deciding, okay, we don't know everything about this drug, but we think it's safe enough to try. We don't want to go through this onerous, expensive FDA process. An alternative with the FDA is the EU has a FDA-like organization for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. So does Japan. They're both super high-tech companies with advanced technology. If they approve it, if either of them approve it, people in the U.S. ought to be able to use it. And it can say on it, not yet FDA approved, but approved by the Japanese or the EU agency. And if the insurance company won't cover it, doctors are unlikely to prescribe it. So really the people who have the firsthand knowledge, the insurance companies, these testing agencies, Underwriters Laboratories, let them make the decisions, not bureaucrats, sort of a top-down FDA, who may make just the right decision, but if they make the wrong decision, who suffers the consequences? Just the people that don't get access to the technologies. So this is a discussion by Fred Smith on CEI about the type 1, type 2 debate. In other articles about this, you see this in the New York Times, even with ivermectin. FDA, if you look on the FDA website, they don't approve it for COVID. They got a picture of a horse just to make fun of people because it's a horse dewormer. But it's also used in Africa for parasites and other stuff. But on the National Institute of Health website, the other major government organization, they have it listed as a COVID therapy. So different parts of the federal government disagree on things, whether it's diabetes or a whole bunch of other technologies. You've got some super overly cautious people that are too precautionary, and many people are suffering and dying because of that. That would be the case against the FDA. So this is another article on the precautionary principle. Critics call it a tool to halt progress. Advocates say it's essential to avoid damage to public health and the environment. And this is more of a history. It begins with the environmental movement, shapes our efforts to curtail climate change, biodiversity, pollution, global poverty. And here's the key message. This is the Stockholm Declaration that laid down the grounds for the precautionary principle in international law, so you can understand this history. Guides to decision makers on what action they should take on environmental safety and where they draw the line in terms of scientific uncertainty. And then critics view the tool as just halting progress. Advocates consider it essential. So again, you should get the sense of the debate over this that's been around now for decades. And here's an article. Now, I give this here in a lot of text here, but here they're saying, this particular article is saying, gosh, good thing we had the precautionary principle, because when COVID hit, some countries took these precautionary measures, including travel restrictions, lockdowns, masks, quarantine, and they saw fewer serious cases and deaths. Other governments, like Sweden, didn't carry out these same precautionary principles, and their citizens suffered in consequence: illness, hardships, and death. Well, this is the claim, and this is dated by the date of this publication, but in fact, this isn't true. Sweden didn't have a lockdown. People didn't wear masks. They were cautious, but they went through this pandemic without the major problems that others did. Texas and Florida didn't lock down. Tennessee, South Dakota, I think, never had a lockdown. So if you wanted to know which is best, you'd look at the different states and which are better. If you wanted to know, you'd look at the different countries. So Sweden had higher mortality than next door Finland and Norway, but also they have a more dense population in Stockholm. They had far fewer deaths than Holland, England, and other parts of Europe. So the debate is still open over whether these lockdown measures we know led to far higher numbers of suicides and drug overdoses and economic harm, but we don't have all the numbers yet of who died. This is a claim that, locking down. Interestingly, though, the WHO didn't even advocate this in the beginning. That is, the former World Health Organization procedures would never advocate a lockdown for a highly infectious disease with a low infection fatality rate. So here's the story that the countries that were precautionary, they took these actions even though they didn't have certainty, and they saved lives and so forth by exercising the precautionary principle. I mean, in a sense, this article is great because it shows the negative side of what it's claiming to support. And the Great Barrington Declaration would say more on this. But again, you've got to debate both sides, and this would be a case for the taking precaution with COVID and lockdown. And on this, I would also make the case, this is drawing from an ethos debate publication by Joshua Anamulu, a top homeschool debater now at University of Pennsylvania, and also from this previous article I mentioned. And also I talk a bit about this on the Cato Daily podcast, Steel Manning 101, using the title that Joshua takes from someone else. And the idea here is a lot of times in debate, in the media and elsewhere, people use straw men. They paint their opponents as, sort of a ridiculous presentation of their opponent just so they can knock it down. And Joshua and others advocate steel manning instead. Make the strongest possible case for the position you oppose and then explain why it's wrong. So in this communications procedure that Joshua talks about, you have someone presenting a position, and the other side, before they can counter it, their job is to restate their opponent's position and, in fact, try and improve it. Try and make it even stronger. Now, this may sound crazy in debate. You've got to refute your opponent's arguments, but first improve them, make them stronger than your opponent did, and then refute them. Well, first off, if you can do that, it'll certainly impress the judge. It'll show that you have a grasp of the issue. But also, in everyday life, we want to understand the different positions. That's why we have debaters debate both sides of a resolution. You want to understand the strongest side of both the reasons for the precautionary principle and the case for the proactionary principle. And, that's why you debate both sides. But this is another way to look at it, which is to, don't build straw men, build steel men, and still knock them down. Although everyone knows you can't beat Iron Man. Okay. I mentioned before the costs of the FDA and other regulations designed to keep us safe. And here's another measure of that is interesting, and your judges would appreciate it too. Some advocate of the precautionary principle say we just want to make sure it's safe. We want to make sure that that ladders aren't dangerous, so we have to do testing and put warnings on them and so on and so forth. But too much safety is a form of tax, too much regulation. So what's the cost of regulation in the status quo? That's measured by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org, in their annual publication called 10,000 Amendments. They estimate a $1.9 trillion hidden tax of regulation. It's larger than the corporate and personal income taxes combined. And this isn't just environmental regulation or making cars safe. This is beyond the safety that serves the public to artificial or outdated or just onerous or bureaucratic regulations that don't serve any purpose, but build up over time in the Federal Register, hundreds of thousands of pages of antiquated regulations. So each U.S. household, they say, has a burden of about $14,000 a year. This is my ad for my pillow on the top there, an email. So $14,000 annually. 17% of pre-tax household income goes to this excess regulation. So it's a huge expense. And the argument, and this was part of the Reagan administration to cut regulation, and also the Trump administration, to some extent the Bush administrations, and even the Obama administration tried very hard to reduce labor regulations that made it hard for people to start companies or get jobs. So there's always an effort to reduce regulation, but at the same time, other federal agencies are cranking out more and more regulations in the name of being safe, of the precautionary principle. So on the flip side of what I just presented is another organization that is a coalition for, they call it sensible safeguards. So these are people saying, look, there's a war on regulation pushed by big business, and we need reasonable regulations, safe regulations. You can go to this site, and they're making the case that, look, this ongoing assault on public protections, we need to, keep those safe regulations and not let corporations just cut and hack away at regulations that are safeguarding people. So, for young people, it's a shame that there's reasonable sounding arguments on both sides, but that's reality. And so we want the right, it's like the porridge. You don't want it too hot or too cold. You want it just right. We want safety. I'm making the case that certification agencies like Underwriters Laboratories and insurance will find the right temperature porridge. But these two organizations are advocating much less regulation or holding on to some. And so they talk about the war on regulation, the case for regulation, anti-regulatory legislation, and so on and so forth. So it's worth looking at, and again, trying to get a sense of the different sides. And this, of course, would fit to the precautionary principle side of this LD debate. So here's some more on strangely dangerous things. If you've seen Jurassic Park, the Hollywood movie where they decide to make a theme park, bringing dinosaurs like the Tyrannosaurus Rex back to life, your first thought might be, that's not a good idea. But they say, hey, we'll build it on an island, we'll build big walls, we'll put the security system, it'll be safe, and it'll be hugely entertaining. It turns out it was entertaining, at least the movie, but it wasn't safe. But in the background of the movie, apart from the dinosaurs ripping people apart, is the mathematician Ian Malcolm, played by Jeff Goldblum, and he predicts the downfall of the park because of chaos theory, because we don't know what small changes in our environment might lead to big, predictable, unintended effects somewhere else. So nuclear radiation for the atom bomb and nuclear power, we get Godzilla, the big monster, caused by radiation. We get this China syndrome where it meltdown and the nuclear plant goes all the way down to China. Pollen from GMO corn. The concern was they did it to make the corn better and safer, or more corn cheaper, but the pollen might hurt bees. Later that wasn't the case, but they thought it would be the case. Refrigerator coolant, CFCs, supposedly led to the ozone declining and disappearing, although it's come back. DDT, this miracle drug, this safe drug for people, would kill mosquitoes and stop malaria, save millions of lives. But later, Rachel Carson and others said, hey, we're going to come to a spring where there's no birds because they've all been killed by pesticides. Because DDT builds up in fatty tissues, so that kills the bugs, but the birds eat the bugs, and the big birds eat the small birds, and then the raptors, the eagles, they have this DDT built up, and so they get endangered. So that was the concern. So they banned DDT. However, later studies doesn't find DDT quite as dangerous as was earlier thought, or that it was overused. CO2 from cars and cement will lead to global warming and climate change. So these were all fears that technology we use will cause disaster. Hydraulic fracturing, lead to methane emissions, groundwater pollution, CO2 emissions, faucets on fire. So these are all danger things. They talk about the butterfly effect in Jurassic Park. A butterfly's wings here might cause a thunderstorm 500 miles away. So it's a sort of the ultimate precautionary principle. Don't change anything because you can't know what effects it would have. Now, the author of Jurassic Park is a scientist, the author of the book, Michael Crichton, and he's written a fascinating novel. He wrote many novels. Jurassic Park was one, but another one was State of Fear. Now, Hollywood's not going to make a movie from State of Fear because in this movie, the bad guy is not the accidental effect of bringing dinosaurs back to life. The bad guys in this are environmental organizations that artificially create huge levels of panic about the environment as a way to raise money. And so they're running around killing people to save their donations as environmental organizations. And the criticism currently of environmental organizations that are scaring people like crazy is that they're full of special interests. The people making money in electric cars, windmills, solar power, there are a lot of entrepreneurs and good businessmen, but also they benefit when there's government regulations, subsidies, cracking down on oil and coal and other fossil fuels. So you get environmentalists and people authentically concerned, as well as special interest groups, as well as environmental groups who have big payrolls and lots of people on staff and raise hundreds of millions of dollars every year by scaring people about the coming apocalypse because we haven't followed the precautionary principle. You can watch Michael Crichton talk about this and how the Independent Institute has he's passed away, unfortunately, from cancer, but he gives a talk on State of Fear, Science or Politics. You can find it at the Independent Institute. There's lots more on this topic, and I hope maybe I can make another, and I have posts online at my Economic Thinking website. Thank you very much for listening, and if you got this far, again, thanks you so much.